Well, welcome everybody to this special Tapas webinar. And thank you so much, Bill. Bill Van Patten is our webinar host today, and we're very grateful that he's here. So thank you for your time. And I always have this debate with myself, like whether to do this big introduction or not, because I think those that are here know exactly or who you are, but I'll just say this is Bill Van Patten, international superstar and an amazing person who is we're very grateful to have here on this webinar. So I will actually, I'm not sure how the screens are, but I'm going to mute myself now, Bill, and just let you take it from here.
Okie dokies. All right then. I'm hoping everybody can hear me fine. I have lost the bottom of my screen where it says I can share stuff. So let me see where I can do that.
And while you're looking for that, I will say this is being broadcast in two different places. So welcome to those who are here through Zoom and also through Facebook Live on the Savio Books page. And so we'll be monitoring both of those, and you can ask questions. We're going to go through the webinar first and then open it up to questions at the end. But yeah, welcome in both places. Do you see it, Bill, on the bottom?
It's not coming up. My screen doesn't have that. So let's see here.
Let me do this really quick. I think this might work.
Maybe it's because I should
Got
be
it now?
Nope.
I just made you a host.
Yeah, I saw that. This happened to me the other day, and then all of a sudden it appeared. So let me just see here where it went.
That's really weird.
It is really weird. I didn't even bother to look at that earlier because I didn't even notice it until right now when I had to go click on it. So let me see here. All right. Well, let's see here. I can go to, how about start share? There we go. There's another way to get to it. I just had to find it.
Yay. I can see it now. Perfect.
Good.
Okay, I'm muting myself now. Take it away.
Go. Yeah, unfortunately with Zoom, not unfortunately with Zoom, I mean, it's fine. There's, those of you who don't work with Zoom, there's normally a little toolbar at the bottom where you can do everything, but for some reason it wasn't coming up in mine. So I had to go find in Zoom on the drop-down menus where you could share screen. That just took me a minute. So sorry about that. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our webinar today from Tapas. The topic is why explicit knowledge cannot become implicit knowledge. I hope this is an intriguing topic to everybody. I mean, that's probably why you're here, right? So I'm going to just jump into it because the sooner we get into it, the more we have time for you to interact and ask questions and tell me what's on your mind about this topic. Okay, so let's first let's get some definitions out there because that's always important to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. So what is explicit knowledge? Let's talk about that first. Explicit knowledge is knowledge that a person can articulate in some way. And notice the qualifier, even if it's wrong or only partially correct. Most of our explicit knowledge we have about stuff, just so you know, is normally wrong or partially correct. So we'll get some examples here so you can see what I mean. So example, I before E except after C, right? And that works great, but it's wrong because in words like weird, it doesn't work and things like that. So we know that, but there's an example of some explicit knowledge I have about spelling. Now, how about explicit knowledge about something like Spanish? You say it for things that are permanent and start for things that are temporary. Most of us who teach Spanish know this is incorrect or only partially correct. I would say it's absolutely incorrect. But this is a classic thing that a lot of teachers walk around with, this explicit knowledge. And actually learners will tell you this. When you ask them, what's the difference between sentence style, they will articulate it this way. So that's their explicit knowledge about that. And then here's one in French for the passé composé, use avoir with transitive verbs and être with intransitive verbs. Again, for a lot of teachers and students, that's kind of a rule of thumb. That's the explicit knowledge they have. And we all, those of us who actually work with French as linguists, know that that's inaccurate or only partially correct. Okay, so what's implicit knowledge? Implicit knowledge is knowledge that a person can't articulate even though that knowledge exists because we can, quote unquote, see it in tests that linguists give. Or when people are speaking or doing things, when we look between what they're doing, we know they have this implicit knowledge, right? Okay, so let's look at an example here. So which of these sentences are possible in English and which ones aren't? And some of you have seen me do this before, these particular sentences. So here are 4 sentences. Jack repainted the room. Hannah redid the slipcovers. The kids repetted the dog. And the baby reslept after it woke up. So if I asked you which of these sentences are possible in English, most of you would say the first one's good. You can say paint and repaint. And then you can say the second one's good. Normalists would say the second one's good because she did the slipcovers. She didn't like them, so then she redid the slipcovers. That's fine. But the kids petted the dog and the kids repetted the dog. No, we don't like that one. And then the baby took a nap, it woke up, and then it reslept. No, we don't like that either. So if I ask you why, give me the rule for why I can use re with the first 2, but I can't use re for the second 2. Most of you can't do it. In fact, I would challenge you to try to do it. Linguists have a hard time explaining this one. But we all have this implicit knowledge. All right, I got another example for you. It's not just about what's grammatical and ungrammatical, but about things that go together in language. So here's an example from my co-hosts on my show, Talking L2 with BVP. So in this sentence, Walter said he would help. You see those little subscripts, the little I under Walter and the little IJ under he? What those little letters represent is how we can co-index pronouns and nouns to each other, okay? So in this particular example, if we say Walter said he would help, we can tell that sentence ambiguous, right? Because the he can refer to Walter, hence the 2 I's, or he can refer to somebody else, the J, okay? So Walter said David would help. And the he there would mean David, and David would be the J, whereas if Walter meant that he, Walter, could help, it would be the I, right? So we know that those 2 interpretations are possible. But what happens with the next sentence? He said Walter would help. Ooh, look at that now. See those little subscripts? All of a sudden, the little I has an asterisk. That means that the he cannot co-index with Walter. So the question becomes, why in the first sentence, Walter said he would help? You get a double co-indexing with he. It could be Walter, it could be somebody else. But in 1B, he said Walter would help. All you've done is switch the order. But now all of a sudden, he can't refer to Walter. It can only refer to somebody else like David, right? Okay, here's another sentence. Angelica is impressed with herself, right? So we have herself goes with Angelica. If we put a little J there for somebody else, it would be asterisk because we want that herself to co-index with Angelica. Notice that if we change herself to her, Angelica is impressed with her, all of a sudden we cannot make the her co-index with Angelica. I forgot to put a little I there for Angelica. But you can see that her there can only mean somebody else. In this case, David's wife, Heather, for example, right? Okay, so here we got examples of how pronouns can co-index with nouns. And the question becomes, what's the rule for pronouns co-indexing with nouns? Particularly in 1A and 1B, we've got the exact same words, we just got a different order of the words. But in one case, they can co-index, in another case, they can't, right? So we have implicit knowledge of how language works that we cannot articulate. Okay, so in the theory of language that underlies most of your theoretical work, explicit and implicit knowledge are qualitatively different. And this is true, actually, and we might have some listeners out there who disagree, but in the major theories that I'm familiar with, for example, I work with generative theory, but even something like usage-based theories and some others would say that no matter what your theory of language is, no matter what you think is in the head, how you characterize it, the explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge really can't be the same thing, right? And I'm going to take a generative perspective in this presentation, and I'm going to use an example from German, the verb second rule, which is based on a 2016 publication. By the way, I have a list of references at the end, so this will be archived, and you can go back and look at those references on your own if you like. Okay, so what's the explicit rule that a lot of people have for German? Something like this. An inflected or conjugated verb always appears in what's called second position in main clause and in simple sentences. And so I promised Lee Forrester, who's listening to this webinar, I'm not going to pronounce this in German because I don't do German. I mean, I could, but I would sound like a 201 student doing it, and I don't want to sound like a 201 student. So we have a German sentence here. where the first word is the subject, the second word is the verb, and then we have to school. Uni is short for university, right? Okay, so I go to school. Now, what happens is that the verb go is in second position. You can see it right there, it's the second word. But what happens when we put something like an adverb in front, like then I go to school? Notice what happens here is that verb go has to stay in the same place, and all of a sudden now the subject appears behind the subject. I mean, behind the verb, right? So this is called the verb second rule, and very often what teachers tell students and what students articulate as explicit knowledge is that you invert the subject and verb if you have an adverb or something in front of the verb. Okay, but the question is that what's really in people's heads? So let's just actually do a little bit of syntax here. This is the roughest part of the webinar. I'm getting out of the way right away. Here's your brain on syntax. Here's your mind on syntax. This little tree underlies every sentence that we make or understand, right? There's some kind of structure, hidden structure in sentences. And sentences consist of two basic kinds of underlying phrases. See those P's? Those stands for phrases. The top one is complementizer phrase, the middle one is tense phrase, and the bottom one is verb phrase. There are other phrases, but I'm stripping it down to nuts and bolts here. Down here, where the verb phrase is, that's where all the lexical stuff originates, okay? All the words that appear in sentences tend to originate down here. And at the top part, this is called the functional part of the sentence, right? So we have the lexical and the functional part. The functional part has all this hidden syntactic stuff in it that makes words and parts of the sentence do weird things to talk in layperson stuff. So when our little sentence in German starts out, it starts out looking like this. We insert all the lexical stuff into the verb phrase, right? So we have our subject in a particular spot under the verb phrase, we have our verb under the verb phrase, and we have our to go to the university in another part of the verb phrase. That XP, by the way, X just means we can put it could be a prepositional phrase, it could be a noun phrase, it could be, lots of things could go after a verb there. So I just put X to simplify. Okay, now, so that's how our sentence starts. But German has some interesting things about it in terms of underlying functional features that cause certain things to happen. So here's our sentence again, and you'll notice that up here is all the functional stuff. That functional stuff has hidden features, and it's telling the sentence, look, I got a job you've given me to do and it's unfulfilled, so give me something. So what it does is it starts to search in other parts of the sentence, and it moves things out so that those particular duties it needs to fulfill get fulfilled. So the subject, as you can see, ich, moves out of the VP, the verb phrase, up to the tense phrase, and then up to the complementizer phrase. And then the verb does the same thing. The verb moves out of its verb position, it goes up and gets tense features, and then it goes up and it winds up in the complementizer position. Or, well, I don't want to give you too much jargon. It winds up in a different part of the sentence. And we don't need to know why this happens. This is what theoretical linguists do. I mean, that would be I could give like 3 lectures on this. So we just want to say that this is what linguists are saying is happening in these sentences. So this is what a German speaker has in his or her head, right? So keep that second tree in mind. Look what that subject pronoun ich is. It's under that one part of the complementizer phrase. Now, let's go over here and look at the sentence when we take the word then. Then actually originates further down in the sentence like everything else. And it gets moved up to the position where the subject originally was. So what does that do? That means that when everything else has to move, the subject can no longer move up to that position. So we don't have a subject-verb inversion going on here. What we have is an adverb blocking the position that the subject originally would have gone to. The subject doesn't have to go there now because that little complementizer phrase goes, hey, I'm happy. You gave me done. It goes here. It works great. It meets the features I have that have gone unchecked. And so I'm good to go. So we're a good sentence, all right? So this is what actually underlies how verb second works in German. And it's much more complicated and abstract than conjugated verbs appear in second position. And if you got an adverb that goes in the first position, then you invert the subject and verb. There's no such thing as inversion. That doesn't happen. What you literally have is a blocking of subject movement. Okay, all right, good. That's the technical stuff. We're done with all our technical stuff. So that's one example of how explicit and implicit knowledge of language really, really differ. So what that example illustrates is that explicit and implicit knowledge are qualitatively different. They're like oil and water, right? They are knowledge types that are different in substance. So the question becomes this: can explicit knowledge turn into implicit knowledge? Can one thing become something else? And because you know the title of this webinar, you know what my answer is. The answer is no. There is no learning mechanism in language acquisition that turns explicit knowledge into implicit knowledge. None. Now, I know some of you out there think, aren't there theories that say if you practice, you automatize? Yes. Automatized knowledge is not the same thing as implicit knowledge. Those are different constructs, okay? So get that out of your head. You practice something until you learn it, you automatize it. That is not what implicit knowledge is, okay? That's just automatized procedural knowledge, and that's something completely different, okay? So what we do know, regardless of the main theories out there, is that implicit knowledge of language builds up over time via an interaction of communicatively embedded input, that is the language you hear and read in context that's intended for communication, and internal mechanisms that work on data derived from that input, right? That's how we know it works in general. All the little nuts and bolts of that are missing from this discussion. That's a whole other webinar. Okay, so what happens then is that explicit knowledge, because of the way it is learned, is stored in one place in the head, while implicit knowledge, because it's learned another way, is stored in another. And there's no interaction between the two. So in other words, they don't interface. The two systems of knowledge don't interface. So you have explicit knowledge on one part of your head, and you got implicit knowledge on another, and you got this barrier between the two. So if explicit knowledge tries to impact implicit knowledge, it can't. It just can't do it, right? And actually it works both ways. Implicit knowledge can't become explicit knowledge. Now, linguists develop explicit knowledge about implicit knowledge. That's what we do for a living, right? Like that German verb second rule. We have explicit knowledge. Linguists have explicit knowledge about what's going on in people's heads. But that doesn't mean what we know about German has now become our explicit knowledge. It means we've reflected and thought about what we know implicitly, and now we're trying to describe what we know implicitly with our explicit language. So it's both ways. Explicit knowledge doesn't become implicit knowledge, and implicit knowledge doesn't become explicit knowledge. Okay, now, here's another example from Ser and Estad. And this is gonna be a little bit different than what we just did because it's gonna involve some language acquisition here. So one of the things that learners in Spanish learn is that with adjectives, you set for things that are permanent and stop for things that are temporary, right? So that's a rule of thumb. I actually saw this on Facebook the other day. A bunch of teachers were talking on a site, and one of them said, oh, just tell them this because this is true. And I went, oh, no, it's not. Okay. So why isn't it? Okay. Because based on everyday speech, we see right away examples where it's not true. So you say, soy joven, I'm young, but I won't be someday. So it's not permanent, right? Or está muerto, he's dead, and he'll always be dead. And so these kinds of things start to trip students up when they try to reconcile explicit knowledge with the data out there, right? And the list goes on. There's all kinds of examples that show us that this kind of explicit knowledge is just doesn't capture what's in someone's head. Now, but what happens actually in language acquisition? That's what's interesting. And what we see is that at every stage of language acquisition, the learners are doing something implicitly, right? So stage one of acquisition of sentence style, we see no verb. So what learners do very, very, very early on, is you capture them in spontaneous speech. They say things like Juana alto, so John tall, no verb. Or Maria enfermo, they don't even do the adjective agreement, right? So it's not enferma, but enfermo. So Mary's sick. They're literally speaking Chinese here, for example, right? Okay, stage two is set is used in most contexts, except for chunks. We don't count chunks because that's not rule derived. So now you get things like Juan es alto, that's fine, but you still get, now you get Maria es enfermo, El profesor no es aquí. La chica es correr. So the professor is not here, and the girl is running. And those last three examples, for those of you who don't know Spanish, are incorrect. They should be María está enferma, el profesor no está aquí, and la chica está corriendo, right? Okay, so stage 3 is we see learners, we see estar emerge, and learners get control over estar as an auxiliary verb. So that's when you start to get things like la chica está corriendo. And you might at first, they might not get corriendo right. You might get la chica está corre, la chica está correr, but you can see that they're starting to incorporate está as an auxiliary, and very quickly the NDO forms come into. And then finally, the last stage is estar as an actual copular verb. Okay, copular that links a noun or noun phrase and a predicate phrase, right? So that's when you get María está enferma, el profesor no está aquí, and so on. All right, so those are the descriptive stages. So what does this mean in terms of our explicit implicit knowledge issue? What is happening in the mind, brain, and learner, right? Clearly, the stages are not reflective of any rules learned. David Wiseman is a teacher of Spanish. I guarantee you, David has never taught his learners to not use a verb, right? David has never said, oh, to say John's child, just say Juan Alto, right? No, they do that on their own. So it's not something that's reflective of anything they've learned. All right, so let's look at stage 1, for example. So what's happening here? So we get no verb, and again, that's typical. And it's not that it's ungrammatical. It's ungrammatical for Spanish, but it's not ungrammatical in languages like Chinese, Arabic, and Navajo, right? Arabic in present. In the past tense, you actually have to put something in, but in Chinese, never, Navajo, never. Okay, so languages don't have to put these kinds of verbs in. Some of them don't even have them. The issue here is one of finiteness, right? So verbs tell a clause, verbs indicate whether a clause is finite or not. And what does finite means? Whether it's carrying tense or not. So what the learner is doing at stage 1 is saying, all my sentences are not finite. That's a pretty abstract and implicit idea to have in your head without knowing you have it, okay? So the person is saying, this language is like Chinese, it's minus finite in the early stage. Okay, they don't stay in that stage too long, and then instead it becomes the verb to carry auxiliary and copular functions, right? So now what does this mean? It means that the learner has figured out that Spanish requires you to mark clauses, whether they're finite or non-finite. So when a sentence is finite, you have to insert some kind of verb to carry a tense feature. So satisfying, because it's featureless. It doesn't have anything else in it that clashes with anything. So I can stick it in any form and to show finiteness, and I'm good. Again, that's a pretty abstract and implicit thing to be going on in a learner's head. That's behind the scenes, right? Okay, next stage. Is stage 3. This is where estar emerges an auxiliary. That's, for example, María está corriendo, or la chica está corriendo, right? So what we have here is two things going on. So we still have the fact that a sentence has to have a finite feature expressed. And in this particular case, we also have progressive. So now the learner has matched finiteness with progressive, and that you have to have a verb to carry both tense features and aspectual features. And that verb in this case is estar, right? Okay, so the final stage is stage 4, estar used with adjectives. And that's when you get María está enferma, and also locatives where el profesor no está aquí. Right, so what this means is that the learner has figured out that there's a perfective feature to adjectives. Adjectives can either be perfective or not, which means that adjectives or states with implied or known beginning and end points are plus perfective, okay? And they will take a verb that is plus perfective because they have to match. This then creates a new functional feature projected in the syntax because the verb has to move out to get perfectivity checked along with the adjective. So in short, adjectives can be plus minus perfective, and the syntax selects a verb with the same features. All this is going on without the learner really knowing that's what's going on, right? And there's all kinds of reasons we motivate this technical stuff based on our research with multiple languages and things we see in both acquisition and in language more generally. Now, what's interesting is when we give advanced learners of Spanish tests on subtle properties of these verbs, implicit knowledge shows up. So here's something that learners are never taught. And I've given this test to like third-year learners, and they do it without any problem. So the butler enters the room and says, si quieren pasar al salón, so if you want to go into the drawing room, el té, the tea, es servido is served, or está servido is served. They both mean it's served. And they're both grammatical, both, but one is a state of passive and one is an agentive passive, okay? And so what the learner has come to understand is that in this particular situation, there's perfectivity underlying the situation. There's a beginning point that's implied in the sentence. And so the selection for está servido is made because that is the one that goes with perfectivity. Even though you can say el té es servido en Inglaterra con limón y azúcar. So tea is served in Great Britain with lemon and sugar. That's a perfectly fine thing to say too, but that's a different kind of passive, right? So even though learners never taught this, and we give them these tests, they select the correct verb. How do they do that? Because they have this underlying implicit knowledge of the perfectivity of estar and the non-perfectivity of things like ser. So the stages tell us that, and we can look at all kinds of stages in English, French, German, Spanish, that the learner is developing abstract and complex systems independently of any rules learned and taught, even if the system at stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and so on is non-native, okay? Just because it's non-native does not mean it's not complex and abstract. It's abstract and complex, but in a non-native way, right? Okay, so what else do we want to say here? That we have both theoretical reasons and empirical evidence that explicit and implicit knowledge are qualitatively different things. They're like oil and water. And then we also know that explicit knowledge cannot become implicit knowledge, that the mechanisms for language acquisition, for learning explicitly, and the mechanisms for learning implicitly are just different. Okay, so based on this, we can kind of rule out that present plus practice as a way of getting implicit language in learners' mind and brain doesn't work. We can just rule it out. Okay, so explicit learning, because that's what present plus practice is explicit learning, right? So explicit learning cannot turn into implicit learning, or explicit knowledge cannot turn into implicit knowledge. Okay, now, here's a different question that's kind of related. This is one I get all the time. And I'll be done in about, I think, 5 minutes, or 5 or 10 minutes, so I'll have plenty of time for questions. Can explicit knowledge help learners get implicit knowledge? Does it speed things up? Does it help learners, quote unquote, notice things in the input? We had a great show yesterday well, I thought it was a great show. And we talked a little about noticing on the air on Talk on L2 with BVP. So let's get into this. The short answer, of course, is no, right? So I'm going to tell you why. First, because explicit knowledge is stored separately from implicit knowledge, it can't interact with it to shape it or push it, right? So again, remember that little slide we saw earlier with explicit knowledge on one side and implicit knowledge on the other, and a little red bear in between, and they don't talk to each other? So we know from that that explicit knowledge can't interact, even in some indirect way, with implicit knowledge to push it along or do anything to it. Second, explicit knowledge is woefully insufficient for describing most things about language. It could, or it would, actually make implicit knowledge do wrong things. So look at that explicit knowledge about set and estar, for example. That leads learners down a terrible path about how estar actually works, right? And how ser actually works. And if that explicit knowledge interacted with implicit knowledge, it would lead them down the wrong path, right? And maybe you might think it does, but that's not why we see the stages we do. We actually have some research, not a lot, but a couple of studies I can think of, that actually show that learners who learn naturalistically, that is without the benefit of explicit knowledge because they're immersed. Oh, I just touched I have a new little mouse pad. So it's kind of cool. I just touched it by accident. We have evidence that learners who learn without the benefit of the classroom actually become more native-like than learners who are bound by classroom stuff, by classroom rules. That the classroom rules actually keep them from getting some of those parts of the grammar that something is, it's actually, I don't know what it's probably making them filter the input in a certain way. I'm not quite sure what it's doing. But the research is interesting, but we want to get into it to here because it'll take us too far. So I'll be happy to answer questions about that during the time frame that we have for questions. Okay, also, explicit knowledge can't help learners notice things in input either, at least not notice that which is implicit. Right? Okay, so example. Learners can't notice the plus perfective feature in adjectives and verbs in Spanish. I mean, those of you out there who've learned Spanish, did you ever remember sitting there going, oh, that adjective is plus perfective. I just noticed that. Of course you didn't. Then learners can't notice that Don is feeling this specifier position of the compromise phrase and blocking subject verb and word. That's not what they're noticing, right? But that's what's underlying grammar. And learners can't notice what is ungrammatical because input only contains grammatical sentences. So, for example, go back to that Walter and he business with the pronouns. Walter said he would help. He said Walter would help. And only in one of those cases can he and Walter be co-indexed, right? And in other times we try to co-index them in the sense ungrammatical. But you don't get a grammatical sense, and you're never told what's ungrammatical when you're learning language as a first language. And believe it or not, all those kinds of examples I gave you is not what you get feedback on in the second language either. You get feedback on what we call surface features, right? So, but even if you just are learning through input without feedback or anything, you still can't notice what is ungrammatical, and that's a problem for noticing. You still have to come up with why something is not permitted in a language. And that's due to other things going on in your head than noticing. So even if you look at things like past tense markers or case markers and things that are on verbs, things that are on nouns, things that are on articles, they aren't subject to noticing. So why aren't they? Because first of all, it's not at all clear that learners acquire endings separately from the words they are attached to. What the evidence actually suggests, I talked a little bit about this in the show yesterday, I'm going to mention it again here, is that we don't learn, for example, nouns and their endings and we combine them. We don't learn verbs and their endings and we combine them. That's not the way acquisition works. That's the way it works in a classroom in a sense of explicit learning, but that's not the way acquisition works from input. So what the evidence suggests is that whole words are stored, right? So I store a bunch of past tense words, right? Past tense verbs. And what happens is, as my lexicon, my mental dictionary builds up, all those exemplars of past tense words allow me to derive and generate past tense endings from words that I don't know or that I'm trying to comprehend that might be new words, right? So what you have is lightning fast. I mean, we're talking about milliseconds of triggering in your brain that suggests us what's going on. And what's our evidence for this? Because both in first and second language acquisition, we have reaction time evidence that shows words that learners encounter, words with endings that learners encounter frequently, like past tense things, like some of the irregulars, like fui in Spanish and had in English. I won't take irregulars, even though they're not irregulars, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But let's say a word like trying to think of a word that's a very frequent word. I can't think of one right now. But what happens is when I get, let's say watched is much more frequent than hatched, right? So I watch TV, I watch this, I watch that. But how often do I talk about hatching an egg, right? So watch is much more frequent. And we see that the ability to process watched is much faster than the ability to process hatched. Right? And so that suggests then that even though, and then we get nonsense words, and those are even slower. So what it means is that the more experience you have processing whole words, those get stored holistically. And then you derive things from them. But you don't create a system where you have bare verbs and endings, and then you do this. Okay. And again, that's true in both first and second language from what we can tell. Okay, so that brings me to the concept of exceptions. This is not really on topic, but I want to bring it up because this happened on Facebook the other day. So I want to just throw it out there because it's kind of related. Because it's related to the issue of explicit learning. Many teachers like rules, right? And textbooks, I mean, they look at textbooks and they go, oh, I don't like that French textbook. The subjunctive comes late, and I don't like the way they explain the subjunctive, blah, blah, blah. And Spanish go, I don't like the way they do 7-star or preterite and perfect. And Germans go, I don't like the way that, I think they should do that, and so on, right? So teachers look at textbooks largely for their rules and how they do the grammar. Believe it or not, that's what they do. It's the first thing to look at. They can talk all about culture and anything they want, but it's really the grammar and textbooks that drives what teachers look at. And so they like the rules. And what happens is anything that doesn't fit in those rules, they call exceptions. This happened on Facebook the other day. They were talking about setting us on Facebook, and a teacher said something about, well, just, ser is permanent and estar is temporary. And a person says, but that's not true, because then you have estar muerto. And the teacher writes back and says, well, there are always exceptions. Well, no, there's no exception there. The problem is that languages don't like exceptions. Languages actually strive for uniformity as much as possible, and they are highly, highly regular. And just because something doesn't fit into your rule doesn't make it exception. Most likely, and I don't think it's just my opinion, but most likely the rule is just wrong, because there are no rules to begin with. There's something else underlying what you see. Your explicit rule is like trying to look on the outside to something that is complex and abstract, and you're trying to articulate it, when what is abstract and complex is quite different. Again, it's qualitatively different stuff, right? So this rule is wrong because there's no rule here to begin with. There's something else much different going on. Okay, so let's summarize real quick, and then we'll move to some interaction and some question and answers. So first of all, explicit and implicit knowledge are qualitatively different things. They develop independently via different means and routes. They involve different learning mechanisms and different things in your head. One cannot turn into the other. And explicit knowledge does little, if anything. I'm going to put that hedge, if anything. I think it does nothing, but does little, if anything, to help the implicit system along when it comes to the formal features of language. Now notice I underscore the formal features of language, because explicit knowledge, it's not clear what it does for you to help get meaning. Like you see the word dog and you discover it means the word dog, right? So you see perro, or you see cane in Italian, or you see, what is it in French, or chien. And in German it's Hund, right? And so you see these words and you match them to this concept of what a dog is. We're not talking about whether explicit learning helps you do that. It may. We're not talking about whether explicit learning helps you with sociolinguistic appropriateness, like, oh my God, don't address them that way, that's rude. Address them this way. We're not talking about that stuff. We're talking about the formal features of language, what we traditionally call grammar, the morphosyntactic, and even the phonological components of the language. That's what we're talking about here. All right, so with that said, I'm going to give, these are the selected references I have for you. They will be available. David will tell you we're going to archive this and where it'll be and so on. So you don't have to write this down now, you can come back to them. And I've been particularly selected here. If you go into these actual readings and look at their bibliographies, you can start to proliferate things you can read on your own. And I've selected critical things here. Bonnie Schwartz was not critical. John Truscott and I have been critical about some things. In my book, while we're on the topic, I'm more descriptive. And in my 2010 article on 7-star, I'm more descriptive. In 2016, I'm critical. And John's critical in 1998. And Bonnie, in her 1993 article, is basically telling you why it's descriptive without anything evaluative there. So, but again, there you can start with those readings if you want to read more about this stuff, and you expand from there. So with that said, I'm going to say, thank you. It's your turn. So let the questions come. We can do this any way you want. So David, should I get out of this now in case we want to see people on?
Yeah, some of this is experimental with the technology. I think if you get out of share screen,
okay,
good.
And I can always come back and put slides up if people ask a question. So that's not a problem.
Let me see. So yeah, so on Facebook or on Zoom, you're welcome to post questions in the chat boxes. And then on Zoom, if anyone wants to come on live and talk, we can do that too. Just let me know in the chat box if you have a question and you want to ask it live. Otherwise, let me see if we have any questions now. I don't see any on Zoom. And you can,
Yeah,
can you
people
see
are thinking about it. That's why.
And then let's see, Facebook's a little bit behind, but it looks like, yes, they're starting to come in. See, Marcy Sheldon asks, in which context would explicit learning be valuable? Oh, it just moved it. Be valuable in a curriculum designed around comprehensible input.
Valuable in what way? Again, because explicit knowledge can't become implicit knowledge. And what you're developing through comprehensible input is implicit knowledge, right? Hopefully. And hopefully through comprehensible input, you're not trying to teach language learners. You're hoping you're letting acquire language. So we have to be careful how we use that term, comprehensible input, and how we use it in the classroom. There is no, again, explicit knowledge is useful to help people get meaning, but not formal features. So if you stop and tell someone, oh, by the way, this word means X, and you keep going, that could be useful because that keeps the comprehension communication going. That's an explicit stopping thing and telling them what something means. But stopping them and telling them, oh, this is how set and aside works, and then go on, because presumably the point of comprehensible input is not to teach set and aside anyway, right? It's to do something else. So it's hard for me to talk about explicit knowledge in the context of input-based classrooms. Yeah, so I'll say that.
Okay. Should we jump over to Zoom? Looks like we have a couple here. Can you see those? Can you talk a bit more about the difference between automaticity and implicit knowledge?
Right. What automaticity is, according to skill theory, is that you can learn certain behaviors and through not necessarily practice in the traditional sense of practice, but practice in the psychological sense of practice, which is doing that thing in the context which you're supposed to do it over and over again. So when David and I talk, and there's phrases we use and we reuse, we're communicating and we're using and reusing those phrases. We're not practicing in a classroom sense of the word, but in psychology we are practicing because we keep using, and what we do is we end up giving those phrases higher activation levels, right? And so in skill theory, what we say is we automatize certain kinds of behaviors. But behaviors aren't knowledge. So if David could have a chunk of language, and even though he knows the individual parts, he can turn that chunk of language into something automatized. He can use quickly and effortlessly. But that doesn't mean he has an implicit knowledge that underlies the syntax and morphology of what he's saying. Those are two separate things. So, for example, in skill theory, there's no such thing as perfectivity on a verb. Skill theory doesn't have a theory of language. So skill theory, for example, wouldn't talk about perfectivity or features or even case endings and how cases are related to there's an interface between syntax and semantics and yada, yada, and blah, blah, blah. Where implicit knowledge would have to talk about those things. Okay.
Awesome. Back to Facebook. So Jill Gonzalez Trimmer says, there's a discussion about telling time. Some native speakers of Spanish would say like, son las 2:10. Some would say, son las 2:10. Some would say, son las 2:10. Is native language in constant flux?
Yeah, but notice that you're looking at the surface properties of language. But notice the syntax isn't changing. You still have to use son, not están. It would surprise me. You would have to get, I don't know what you'd have to do to me, or what would happen to me if you could give me a native speaker who say, están las dos. No. So just like in English now, we used to say give something, right? And now in English, I think it started with Seinfeld. I don't know who, and I don't know where this word came in, but all of a sudden gift is now a verb. So he gifted me something, or I gifted her something. So languages can do that, but notice that all the formal properties of language are still being obeyed. The formal properties of language are slow to change. They do change, they can change, but they're very, very, very slow to change. Whereas things like you're talking about, whether you drop a preposition, use this preposition or that preposition, those things, of course, can change because they're not part of the morphosyntactic elements of the language, the formal properties of language.
Got it. So I just say in advance, if I miss your question, there are a lot of them coming in, so we'll just keep bouncing back and forth. If I don't see it, post it again. Just keep putting it up there because the comments are going quickly, especially on Facebook. So back on Zoom again. Let's see. Nicole asks, what happens if you have a specific time to teach something? How can you teach it without making it explicit? If you're short on time, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, you can't have your cake and eat it too. That's my answer. Implicit knowledge develops through mechanisms you cannot control. All you can control is input, the quality and quantity of input that learners get in the classroom. But you can't make them implicitly acquire something. It's not, input is not a technique to replace explicit teaching. And so when you say you have a specific time to teach something, that means that you're going to do explicit teaching, and they're going to get explicit knowledge, but they're not going to get implicit knowledge. They're not going to acquire language. So again, that's trying to put a square peg in a round hole, or having a cake and eat it too. I don't know what the metaphor is, Nicole. I'm sorry, but it's one of those weird situations where this confronts all of us all the time at both K through 12 and university level. People go, I want to do this, but I don't have this time. I'm supposed to get this. I'm supposed to cover like case endings now. Well, you don't cover case endings in acquisition. Case endings happen to learners over time through interaction with input. You can't cover subjunctive in acquisition. Subjunctive, and all these things are stage-like anyway. So, and there's so many individual differences too in the sense of how fast people go and so on. So it's just putting a time frame in acquisition is quite a bit difficult.
So here's one that's coming up on both Facebook and Zoom independently. What about pop-up grammar?
No, they're colluding. It's like Russia and Trump. They're colluding.
Yeah, you're getting it from both sides now.
Okay. So what about pop-up grammar? Can you talk about pop-up grammar? Pop-up grammar is, as I understand it, as I've seen it, work for those of you who know what pop-up grammar is. It's if you're doing a class that's largely input driven or storytelling and so on, and you're in the middle of doing something, you stop and say, oh, by the way, that thing that you just saw is called this, or you stop and say, oh, this is how this works, by the way, in case you were wondering. And it takes you like 20 seconds to do, and you keep going with what you're doing. I'm being unfair to pop-up grammar, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. Pop-up grammar makes the most sense when it points out what something means. So for example, if I'm doing a story in Spanish and I said, so I'm talking about Dave and I go, entonces David llamó por teléfono. Oh, by the way, class, llamó means he called. Okay, so he called, not he calls, but he called. Entonces David llamó por teléfono. That's like a pop-up grammar where I told him what llamó means. I didn't tell him it's predicate. I didn't tell him about imperfect. I just told him what it meant. And so they can connect that to pastness, that it meant call. And then their mind is going to start to do what it needs to do implicitly to start figuring out how a predicate actually works over time as they get more and more and more examples of predicate. And I don't mean the endings of the predicate. I mean what the predicate actually means, right? Endings are one thing, but with the function of the predicate is something different, right? And so that's the part that's going to always happen implicitly. And so all you're doing is letting them know through pop-up grammar that what that thing means. That, in my mind, is the best way pop-up grammar works, is when you tell them what something means. So you can keep going with comprehension. Okay. What's our next question?
So let's see. Mike Coxon, what do you say to those who say that explicit knowledge can lead to proficiency or fluency?
It can't. What it does in the early stages is it gives the illusion, like learners can learn a lot of explicit stuff early on. I talked about this recently on the show. Learners can learn a lot of explicit stuff early on and make it look like they know language, but they really don't. They're doing some functional stuff using their explicit knowledge. They're kind of not even good with it, but they can do the kinds of things they need to do. But what's happening in the meantime, and Steve Krashen's talked about this, I've talked about this, Patsy Lightbon's talked about, other people have talked about this for the last 30-something, 40 years, is that it's like having baby teeth. In the meantime, acquisition is growing in your head. The stuff that you actually really need to perform function with language is growing. And that stuff takes over. And it's like your baby teeth falling out. So your baby teeth fall out, and that explicit stuff and your ability to do this, the stuff that you were doing at the early stages is now replaced by performance that's based on more implicit knowledge, right? So that's what I would say to that. That was Mike who asked that question? Yeah.
Yeah, yep. Going back to Zoom, let me go back. A few more on here.
Here's one about, let me answer this as a quick question.
Yeah, you bet.
This is another from Nicole. How can you assess the implicit knowledge in a classroom setting of 32 plus students? You don't assess that. There's no reason to assess their implicit knowledge. In a classroom, you wouldn't want to. Why would you want to see if they know the difference between Walter said he would help and he said Walter would help? But why do I want to know their coindexing, all that? Why do I want to know if they know perfectivity and so on? You're never going to test that stuff, because testing implicitly means you also have to test their knowledge of what's impossible in a language, right? And I can give you lots of it, like, are you going to test them and ask them things like, can you say he repetted the dog? Why would you even ask that? So what you're going to do in class always is test performance, but not knowledge. That's what should be. That's what and that's what I'm hoping language teaching has been trying to do. Even ACTFL, that doesn't really necessarily believe in these things I'm talking about. At least one thing that ACTFL is good about is talking about different kind of performance models. And they may not always be right, but they're pointing us in the right direction. So we should be looking at testing performance and not testing knowledge.
Let's stay on Zoom. Let's see. Yvonne says, interesting webinar. Thanks, Bill. What about things like orthography? Can explicit knowledge be useful there? What about the connection between oral and written formal features?
Okay. I'm not sure about the second part of the question, but I'm going to tackle that in a minute. With orthography and spelling, yes, it can probably help. The research in first language acquisition shows that teaching spelling explicitly makes people spell sooner than spell some things better sooner than later. But those who get spelling lessons replaced by intensive reading, by like the third grader caught up in spelling. So reading seems to be what really pushes spelling along in the long run. In other words, orthography can be learned through input as well. Except in the case of if you're learning a whole new like kanji in or characters in Chinese or Japanese or whatever. Okay, so explicit knowledge may or may not be helpful for the orthography. And what about the connection between oral and written formal features? Oral and written formal features are the same. Oral language and written language use the same formal features. The way you embed orally is the same way you embed written, and vice versa. You can do both. And unless you're talking about prescriptive things, like, for example, the difference between who and whom, which nobody does. In writing, I don't make that distinction in my writing. I've got a freaking PhD, right? So I say, that's the man I talk to. That's the man who I talk to, not the man whom I talk to. And whom did you call? No, who did you call? So there's a lot of things that we don't do in writing. And notice how, for example, this entered English a long time ago, by the way. The singulars, like using their, T-H-E-I-R, and they, T-H-E-Y, of course, to refer to singular things, like everyone took their hat. Notice everyone took his hat, but we got rid of his, and so spoken speech is there. And then you have things like, you'll see, you'll hear people say, they'll use the word each in singular followed by their or they, right? Now that's in written English. I mean, so all those things, there's very little difference between formal features in written and oral language. What is different are the rhetorical devices and the elaborate nature of written compared to oral language. So in oral language, we're trying to use fewer clauses. We use more clauses in written languages, but we don't invent new clauses in written language that we can't use orally and vice versa. So for example, in written language, we might use more commas. We don't speak in commas. What we do is we speak in pauses, or we speak in shorter sentences, and we build on those sentences, right? So the formal feature is all the same. It's just I think you're thinking about rhetorical devices and how rhetoric is more elaborate, but it's not grammatically different. Okay, enough of that.
Awesome. Let's jump to Facebook, and we got a lot of questions, Bill. This is good.
Good.
They're scrolling down, so we'll get through them as quickly as we can. Lily's wondering if it's a waste of time to ask students to reread a passage after they have first read it for meaning, and to ask them to notice a repeated form.
She asked if it's a waste of time?
Yeah.
I think it is, but I don't think you get much out of it. I mean, I don't know what they're going to get from doing that. Honestly, I mean, and the research on text enhancement, when you actually bold those things, Lily, and Winnie Wong has written about this. She did a complete review of this literature. It's kind of 50-50. And I mean, sometimes you get results from doing that, sometimes you don't. The problem with the research is when you do get results, it all tends to be explicit knowledge. You're giving them explicit tests afterwards that shows that, yeah, they notice those things they can test, but their actual performance doesn't change. And if you do tests of implicit knowledge, it probably hasn't changed. It's hard to do tests of implicit knowledge on certain kinds of things. But anyway, so yeah, Lily, I personally think it's a waste of time, but I'm not going to say that's what the research says. Okay, next question, David.
Pablo on Zoom. Learners come with their own explicit knowledge. Verbs have endings, Spanish has aspect, etc. For most learners, it seems as if this knowledge hurts their performance. How do we deal with that?
I'm not sure what he means by the knowledge hurts the performance. I think what it is, it hurts. What it does, it gets in their way of wanting to acquire language, because they think that language learning is learning those things, as opposed to being engaged actively with input that's communicatively embedded and comprehensible and appropriate for their level. So I think that one of the best ways of doing that is take my book, for example, like while we're on the topic, and for 10 minutes a week, take a paragraph out of that and share it with the students. Say, I want us to go over this paragraph, what this expert says. It doesn't have to be me. You can find other books to do this too, but I suggest mine because it's written for non-experts, right? It's not a scholarly book. It's written for people, for administrators, for parents, for teachers, and all kinds of people. So students could understand. And spend 10 minutes a week copying them about acquisition. And just over the course of time, you'll get them there. So the thing about language acquisition is the best kept secret. And we're not very good advocates of sharing information with anybody. It's almost like we can't or we're afraid of doing it. So, all right, next question.
Garrett is wondering, first he says a lot of nice things about a similar lecture back in 1999 in Utah. So go Utah. And then he asks, how do you handle a class full of students who only want explicit instruction? And how do you keep them from getting frustrated with their perceived lack of progress through implicit instruction and input processing?
Two things. Change your testing, change your assessment, and make it so that grades aren't dependent on demonstrating explicit knowledge. And the second thing is, when you change that testing, do it so that you can show them at the end of the semester, let's look at what you're doing here, and let's look at what could you have done this back here? Could you have read this that you just read and understood and answered all my questions on? Could you have done this back here? Answer is no. Okay, good. Now, I just gave you a picture task where you describe a couple pictures for me. Could you have done that back? No, you couldn't have. So now tell me you haven't learned anything. That's what we used to do at Michigan State. And that was one of the best ways to get students to go, oh, I guess I kind of have learned something. So.
Awesome. Nancy at Zoom asks, when students practice in class to learn explicit grammatical features, can the sentences student one generates with explicit knowledge, say, student one describes his, her likes, dislikes, serve as comprehensible input for acquisition of implicit knowledge by the other students listening to student one?
Yeah. In other words, when students speak to each other, regardless of why they're, does one student's output become input for another student? That's a perennial question in the field. The answer is yes and no. We don't really know. It's not researched. And again, somebody asked me this on a show yesterday, I think. And we don't really know. A lot depends on the social dynamics. Students intuitively know that the teacher is the source of language, right? So that, for example, look at twins as opposed to single birth children in a family. Twins have a little bit longer language onset compared to single birth children. And that's one thing. And the second thing that twins do in first language is sometimes they're known to make up their own language, right? They don't quite make up their own language, but they kind of sort of do based on what they hear. But notice that twins always wind up with the language of their parents and the household they grew up in. Because they know, just like a single birth child, that that they are not, even though they have a bond and there's something special about twins, that the source of power in that household are the parents. And the community around them as they start to get older and become 3 and 4 and discover there's a world outside the house, right? Then they realize that that's the community they aspire to be. So in classrooms, it's not clear to what extent students feel that social part of language. That's underexplored. And my guess is that if I actually looked hard at the literature on all that social aspect of language, there's probably enough in there where students are looking for that teachers for as a source of things and not as each other. So.
Awesome. Going to combine two again. It's a similar question from Jill on Facebook and Nicole on Zoom. First, what does a performance test look like in a classroom setting? And then even, should we test performance and proficiency?
I'm sorry, say that again. What was the second part?
Jill's was, should we test performance and proficiency? And then Nicole asked, what does a performance test look like in a classroom setting? So I think those kind of go together.
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is, what can people do with language, not what do people know about language? And do can be constructed in various ways. ACTFL has a set of ways of testing. People in like TPRS environments and storytelling environments have some ways of assessing performance that's on reading and then story retelling, or free writing, as it were. I've seen Eric Herman, for example, do assessments of his students over time where he gives them pictures that are related to things, stories they've talked about in class, and they use the pictures and tell stories about things, or does interviews on them. So different ways to assess performance. The question is not so much what does a performance test look like? Well, I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, in the sense of how you structure it. But more importantly, what is you're looking for and how you decide whether a student is good or not. And so let's look at an oral test, for example, an oral performance assessment. In the early stages, if I'm in Spanish 1 or first semester Spanish, there's a standard by which I always look at what my students can do, which is, I'm talking about speaking now. We can look at other kinds of things too, which is that they are limited. And one of the hallmarks of being at that stage is being reliant on the other interlocutor. So reliance on the other interlocutor for constructing conversation is a general yardstick over time about how performance develops. So what happens is learners have to, they gradually move from being reliant on the other interlocutor for constructing the conversation and more toward being full participants, initiating conversations, and helping to co-construct the conversation. Those things are not well mapped out in any performance assessment that I know. So that's what we've got to do. I'm hoping that at ACWA we can talk about these things when we get that new comprehension-based SIG going. That's one of the first things we look at is what kind of performance things do we want for comprehension-based classrooms. And then looking at how they dovetail with things like the actual guidelines and other kinds of measures. So there's no, to answer the question, there's no good models out there. And you're going to have to like free form it. What's the word, David? You have to wing it.
Yeah, wing it. Yeah. Yeah. So I think you already touched on this, but in case you wanted to add anything more, Jill just sent a follow-up to the question, just asked if there's a difference between assessing performance versus proficiency.
Technically, there is. Technically, there is. Proficiency is a covered term for any kind of thing you do. Performance, for me, is a technical term from linguistics that talks about operating with your implicit system and your implicit mechanisms. But we know in the early stages of like the guideline, like novice intermediate, you're not functioning with that kind of system. So it's not performance in that sense. So proficiency is a more global term for any kind of behavior you can observe, which includes performance. Whereas for me, performance means something very specific to being able to function with your implicit system. This is why at the early stages, you function with like one word, because that's what's in your system. You don't have syntax and morphology yet, right? So, but anyway, so yeah, they're different.
Awesome. Mark's wondering if there's a certain amount of science denial in language departments.
Oh, of course there is. I remember being at a faculty meeting when, and I'm going to say a bad word here. I pulled up some statistics on something. It was about graduation. I can't remember what it was. And about students and students achievement, blah, blah, blah. And one of my faculty members, who was not in my field, raised her hand and said, I didn't give a shit about statistics. And I went, okay. So we just swept 500 people under the rug and don't want to know about what they do and know and behave and how they graduated and so on. There's a certain amount of that. There is.
So I think if I missed you on Facebook, one of your questions, post again, because I think I got to the end of the list there. And then Yvonne has another follow-up, I think. Yeah. What I meant to ask was about the connection between phonology and orthography. For example, all the interferences from the L1 when trying to read aloud. But he liked your other answer too. So that's good.
Yeah, I don't even know why you would read aloud in an L2. David, how often, I mean, you're reading aloud right now because you're reading aloud so other people can hear the questions, right?
Yep.
But in the last hour before we got on here, were you reading aloud to yourself?
No.
When was the last time you read aloud to yourself with nobody else around?
I sometimes do, and I'm tired when I'm editing. But otherwise, no.
When you're editing it, okay, but it has a function there, right?
Correct.
It actually has a function there. In L2 situations, people are forced to read aloud because we make them read aloud. But nobody reads aloud. So that's what we hear when learners read aloud is an artifact of what we're making them do that is unnatural and non-communicative and has no purpose. Okay, with that said, now what we don't know is when learners are reading, how they are subconsciously processing orthography and linking it to phonology? That we don't know. And that's one of the banes of our existence. We want reading, we want literacy, we want to push reading early on, we want storytelling and so on. And some people deny written input for a while, and they say, I want to focus on oral input because of the phonology. That's one way to think about it. But it's a problem. The minute you put written words in front of a learner with the orthography that is similar to their first language, you're going to get some of that L1 stuff coming in, and because that's what happens. That's an artifact of what we do, and what we make learners do.
So we just have a few more minutes. So if you have any last questions, feel free to post them. There's just one more that just came up on Facebook. It's actually a series of questions from Alexa. Oh, there's another one. Okay. You recently said something about, I'll just read them all together. You recently said something about novices and intermediate level not being used. It's not useful to test them. Something like it's not very useful to gauge their proficiency level, ? Do you not think it's useful for students to know where they are? My memory's not serving me very well. Maybe you know what I'm referring to.
Yeah, what I actually said was is that if you want to know if learners are functioning from their implicit system, there's no reason to test novice and intermediate learners because they're not doing that. You don't get full functioning from an implicit system until you get to at least the advanced level on the actual scale. Prior to that, learners are doing something else. When stuff comes out of their mouths, it's not because they are unconsciously all the time making sentences. It can be, but and if you look at the descriptions of ACTFL itself, the guidelines, you can see they're actually what's built in there is classroom learning stuff. They're built into those guidelines, and those descriptions disappear by the advanced level. And so what I said, just to clarify once again, Alexa, was that if you want to measure what's actually in the head and got there, and that's implicit, it's not going to happen through a novice and intermediate level test of oral ability. You're not going to see that until they get at least advanced. So when you can't see something, like my work on Sen and Astad, I was able to do it, but that's because I was not giving them an oral proficiency interview that tried to actually test those things that the proficiency guidelines try to test. So.
All right. Well, one more from Alexa again. So can you test level but not implicit knowledge? Just to see where they're at, I'm guessing.
Yeah, but again, I think she's asking, I think the question she wants to ask is, if I test them, what am I testing? That's what I think she wants to ask. My point is, you can test them, and depending on your teaching style, what they've been through, and how much exposure to the language they've had in terms of actual input, interaction with input as opposed to textbook learning and so on, then how you test and what you look at is going to be different, right? And so I think I'm hesitant to talk about levels because I'm not even sure there are levels. To me, it's one big long continuum. So, and we do this because we want to put an A or a B or a C on it. We want to put an advanced on it. Or we want to put a 1 or a 2 or a 2A or a 2B on it. That's why we think in levels. When, I mean, you know what they talk about in child language acquisition? MLUs, mean length of utterance. That has been the traditional measure for where learners are in first language acquisition. So you look at whether it's 1 MLU or 2 MLU or 3 MLU and so on. And that's quite different from the way we talk about it in second language acquisition. We have second language acquisition so lost its way from first language acquisition. It's not funny, but there's still, even though it has its roots in first language acquisition, it really needs to Everybody in and I know a lot of people in L2 acquisition who don't have any background in L1 acquisition. They really should. It really should, because it makes you think outside the box when it comes to language teaching. And some of the questions we ask. So anyway, that's my answer there.
Awesome. Well, I think we've done it, unless there's more more questions out there that are coming, but we're about at the end of the time anyway. But is there anything else, Bill, that you wanted to?
No, just tell them. I think Leah's asked, maybe somebody else asked.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be recorded and archived, so tell people how that's going.
Yeah, so let me just go over again what will happen. So this will be on Facebook Live for a couple of days, or not on Facebook Live, on the Facebook Sabio Books page. But it's going to be permanently archived on the Tapas website. So if you haven't visited the website, it's classroomtapas.com. And so all subscribing members will have access to this webinar and all future webinars, which we're really working on right now to develop the professional development part of Tapas. So if you haven't checked it out recently, go stop by. And especially this month for Hispanic Heritage Month, there are a lot of special deals, offers, giveaways, contests, and so we'd love to have you stop by at classroomtapas.com. But it will be archived there. There's somewhere asking about can it be shared from there with people who aren't subscribers to Tapas? Currently, no, but it's a good question. We can think about that. Right now, it's just if you have a subscription, you can get access to that page. But let's keep the dialogue going. We might be able to figure out ways that you can share parts of this with colleagues or administrators. That would probably be a good thing. And the other thing, just to give a shout out to the weekly talk show, Talkin' L2 with BVP. And so if you go to talkinl2@bvp.com, you can subscribe to the weekly newsletter email that will go out. And so we'll keep the conversation going. But the next webinar, we decided this for sure, Bill?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to have the next one on November 8th at 3 p.m. Pacific again. So we'll try to keep them at the same time on Thursdays. So November 8th, we'll be back here. We hope you join us. We don't have a topip yet, but we're...
I'll probably have a topic by next week or the week after that.
So if
everybody's dying, if we get a slew of emails or requests for a particular topic, we might make it that one. So
awesome. Yeah. If you have recommendations for topics, that would be wonderful. All the contact information is at classroomtapas.com. You can email us, and we'd love to hear from you. So yeah, other than that, thanks for sharing, and thanks for being here with us. And we look forward to the next one. And particularly, Bill, you're getting a endless list of thank yous in the comments section. And
thanks everybody for tuning in.
Starting to come in on Zoom, but no, thank you sincerely for all that you do for the field and here.
By the way, Ivana, real quick on Zoom, asked if there's going to be some bibliography. Tell her, because since she can go into, if she's not a member of Tapas, she can go into the archives in Tapas. If not, go into Sabio Books today or tomorrow on Facebook and go to the slides and go to that one slide I have with references. And in there, you'll be led to different things you can check out. So
yeah, why don't we try to make whenever we have bibliographies like that, make that open access. I can post that on the professional development part of Tapas and just have that open access. That would be, I think that would be helpful.
And then also, Giovanna, if you want to, just Google the name Kara, K-A-R-A, Morgan Short with a hyphen. So Google Kara Morgan Short, and her whole work is about the brain and what languages and where language is stored and all that kind of stuff. So she's the expert. Maybe we'll get her to do a webinar someday.
That would be great. So one last request. If you haven't liked and followed the Sabio Books Facebook page yet, that's the quickest way to get all of the announcements. So everything we're doing, every time we post something on Tapas, or we're going to have webinars or have the talk show, everything filters through the Sabio Books Facebook page. So if you haven't liked that yet, encourage you to do that. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in November and before that. So
yep.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks everybody out there for tuning in. We love you. See you next Wednesday on our show if you tune in.
All right. Sounds great. Bye, everyone.
puso, oy, tapis na